So this chapter is on cities and communities, and more generally speaking, it's on urbanization, which is a real hot topic in sociology. The big questions for the study sheet include what draws people to cities? How do neighborhoods form and change? And they do. Does living in cities influence who we are, who our friends are, and how we live? Why are so many social problems found in cities? And lastly, how will cities change in an increasingly connected world? So question one, what draws people to cities? Um, well, the world became urban over a long period of time. Urban is defined as a population density of 1,000 or more people per square mile in surrounding area, with a population density of at least 500 people per square mile. Rural, on the other hand, is everything else. Urbanization is defined by the Census Bureau as a growth in population proportion living in cities and urban areas. From a sociological perspective, it's a description of how cities and communities form and change and how dimensions of places affect the way people interact with each other. There are new urban forms evolving all the time. One is called a conurb, which would be, an example would be Dallas-Fort Worth area, how it's really difficult to distinguish one from another, or St. Paul, Minneapolis. Then there are mega cities like Mexico City that have populations of 20 to 25 million people, and mega regions like the Northeast Corridor. If you've ever driven from New York to Boston or New York to Washington, D.C., it's very difficult to tell where one city starts and one city stops. There's even suburban changes. Before the 20th century, there was a low population density and trade specialization. Um, the latter bedroom communities and annexation occurred, so they started getting swallowed up by bigger cities. And the term bedroom community means that people would be like working in Chicago and living in Joliet. They would commute. There was this thing called the white flight when white urbanites moved from the urban areas to the suburbs. This happened especially in the Midwest. I grew up in Detroit, and in 1965 moved to Warren, which was only about 5 miles from where we actually lived in Detroit. And then, of course, the process of redlining, which would be, it's illegal to do this, but basically there's zones where housing sales at least used to be restricted to people that were white and not of color. Of course, as I said, that's illegal. And then, of course, there's urban sprawl. The edges of cities just seem to be getting bigger and bigger. Back in the 1980s, when we moved to Illinois, you could tell the difference between Chicago and the suburbs. And now that distinction is all but gone. Question two is, how do neighborhoods form and change? Well, they form and change based on this idea of urban ecology. So in ecosystems, all the different aspects are connected. And the Chicago School did an experiment to see if they could simulate an ecology in nature. Different segments of the population sort themselves into different areas of the city in which they thrive. So blue collar workers living in one area, white collar workers in another area, in different zones of activity. This includes the Park and Burgess concentric zone map of Chicago. So everyone's heard of things like the Loop and the downtown area. Well, this was actually called that because it was a concentric zone map or mapping plan that looked like this. So the loop would be the downtown area. The second zone would be factory zone. The third area was a zone of transition. The fourth area is where the workers that would go into those factories would live. The fifth area was a residential area, which is further out. And the sixth area would be the commuter. This was a model that started in the 1920s. But of course, it's not the 1920s anymore. And 100 years later, things look very different. Keep in mind that this model does not include any of the interstate highway systems. So basically, this model was supposed to be self-contained. And of course, highway systems bifurcated all over the Chicago area, causing all kinds of havoc, and including things like redlining. People living on one side of railroad tracks or one side of the interstate were restricted from being on the other side of the interstate. So this was an experiment that was done in the 1920s. There are political economies of cities and communities. They are seen as growth machines. Events like in Chicago are great generators of income and wealth. So things like a convention maybe held at the Hyatt or the Sheraton brings in tens of thousands of people with rooms, and they have to eat and the activities they do. So they're seen as growth machines. So comparing Chicago, for example, to the rest of Illinois is you would think it was the only city in Illinois, but it's not. Urban change can be thought of as a direct result of political economic interests working to promote growth. In pursuit of growth, local governments regulate use and distribution of land within the city through taxation, policing, and regulation. Racial and ethnic segregation in the growth machine as well. So, for example, when we moved out of Detroit, there was a process of gentrification going on where people would, in some cases, just leave their homes or be kicked out of their homes so that wealthier people could renovate and update their homes, those older homes. Growth coalitions sought to keep poor African Americans and Latino populations from spreading in particular ways. There were no-go zones where people knew not to buy houses or rent apartments in those areas. Different groups bringing different resources and differential influence to political discussion pitted one against the other. So, for example, in Chicago, there are different ethnic enclaves like Chinatown and Germantown and Polish Town, even the Pilsen area with Hispanic influences, all sort of pit one group against another. Question 3, does living in city influence who we are, who our friends are, and how we live? Short answer is, of course, it does. Kleinberg in 2012 documented the growth of the number of Americans living by themselves. This has grown up substantially. It's not necessarily a negative thing either, but they feel some anomie or disconnection from other people. Putnam in 2000 expressed concern about this growing isolation. George Simmel in the first part of the 20th century did seminal work on the effects of urbanization on the individual. City dwellers found both freedom and isolation, which sort of go together. Worth in 1938 saw the city as a large, dense, and permanent settlement of heterogeneous individuals, people living in communities that have specific interests or importance to them. Occupants interact largely anonymously, superficially, and in transitory ways. There's unique occupational and career specializations that happen in big cities. So if you have a specific skill set that may not find work in Ottawa or Streator or LaSalle, Peru, you might be able to find those skill sets needed in an urban area like Chicago. Gans in 1968 posited differences between the types of life in urban and non-urban areas. However, the differences due to demographic and economic differences between groups. So the reason that people live in non-urban areas is because maybe they have the economic resources to live out and commute in. Fisher in 1975 presented a theory of subcultures. Subcultures emerge as a result of size, density, and diversity in urban spaces. I mentioned Pilsen and Hispanic influences in Chicago. That's a subculture. Jacobs in 1961 looked at the physical layout of neighborhoods and how they influence the quality of life in them. New urbanism supports return to mixed-use housing, walkable urban communities. Another example of that is the park system in Chicago and all the parks along the lakefront. Olmsted, who designed Central Park in Chicago, also designed the lakefront, and they realized the importance of these mixed-use urban landscapes. If you're going to be in densely populated areas, you need areas that you can retreat to. How does urbanism affect community? Well, the classical conception of community is changing all the time. It includes family members, neighbors, and nearby friends. They're formed on the basis of geography, that is, you live in the same general area, and the layout of the neighborhood. So, for example, growing up in Detroit, our neighborhood really sort of revolved around the church that we went to. Wellman's conception of community is a little different. The social ties of individuals within cities, or the various types of connections that individuals make with other people despite the setting. So it may be, as I just mentioned, based on a religious preference or occupational preference. And of course, this forms the basis of social networks that we experience today. Research on social networks is emerging. Ellison and colleagues in 2007 looked at online networks. It expands and enhances offline networks as well. So if you're a member of the Chicago Area Runners Club Association, CARA, it's an online network. It was initially, which often leads to offline connecting up as well. It strengthens social capital. That is the influence. So you meet someone in this group that you belong to that maybe is involved in employment. Granovetter in 1974 looked at job referral networks and found weak ties most useful. When I was in graduate school, one of the things that Washington University prided themselves on was their ability to get people placed not only in jobs, but in postgraduate educational opportunities. That's what's important about private schools and private groups, is this referral network. Sampson and colleagues in 1977 found that communication and interaction with local community builds trust and cohesion. You've got skin in the game. Question 4, why are so many social problems found in cities? Well, Engels in 1845 described social problems in poorest urban slums, tenements, and high-rise housing projects. One of the ideas was that the city was itself sick. Jane Addams in 1910 analyzed inequality in American society and engaged in social activism right at the University of Chicago, and up until a couple of years ago, the Hull House was still active. It was basically a house for unwed mothers who were among America's poorest and most disengaged group of people. The Fair Housing Act in 1949 provided federal funds to local governments to help redevelop blighted areas and for urban renewal. So you saw neighborhoods like the Cabrini Green and other Robert Taylor homes emerging in urban areas. Gans in 1962 documented the redevelopment of Boston's West End neighborhood. When I was in graduate school in St. Louis, it was the Cleves Landing was undergoing gentrification and repurposing. Why are so many social problems found in cities? Well, there's concentrated poverty and of course, the urban ghetto. This was noted by Drake and Caton in 1945. Again, back to Chicago. The Bronzeville study documented thriving black culture and social life in Chicago South Side before civil rights movements riots in the 1970s resulted in economic downturns. Characteristics of new urban poverty are different. Weckland in 2009 demonstrated growing concentration of urban poor within a smaller number of extremely high poverty neighborhoods. So there's poverty, and there may be intense poverty as well. Persistence of severe racial segregation despite fair housing laws. Some experts believe that at the root of homelessness and at the root of poverty is not having adequate housing for people. The growth and concentration of joblessness and related social problems is the result of poor housing and extreme poverty. What changes have led to neighborhoods within concentrated poverty in the United States? Well, a sociological argument over the past 50 years was promoted by William Wilson, and he points to the loss of manufacturing jobs. It is in those manufacturing zones. The migration due to minority populations lost working job class. So if there's no manufacturing, the people that ran the manufacturing jobs leave because they're unemployed. Fewer manageable black men, more single-parent families. Fewer marriageable black men. That is, mothers being the head of household in black families. More single-parent families and more welfare recipients. And of course, the middle class retreated and deterioration of the church in many schools. So the middle class moved out of urban areas to more suburban areas, and both the deterioration of church and schools followed. Segregation and urban diversity is a major issue. Racial and ethnic segregation has resulted in some key legislation, including the 1968 Fair Housing Act, made discrimination in public and private housing markets illegal. There's only been a slight decline in most major U.S. cities. Most of it goes undetected. 1965 Hart-Celler Act overrode previous national origin quota systems, rapidly changed the flow of immigrants into the United States. Incidentally, we've always had immigration into the U.S., both documented and undocumented since we've been a nation. The diversity in American cities is another important matter. We now have global neighborhoods, that is, not just geographically close, but connected to other neighborhoods around the world. Certain members of different racial groups and ethnic groups tend to live together. Barrios, of course, is a term that happens in South America, represents Hispanic equivalent of a black ghetto. And then segmented assimilation, that is, highlights one of several possible pathways into immigration assimilation. So doing it in more of a stepwise manner. Question 5 is, how will cities change in an increasingly connected world? That's a good question, and nobody really knows. There are some guesses. Immigration in the urban landscape is important. Immigrants make up more than a quarter of population in the nation's 17 largest cities. They're a huge voting group. They're a huge economic group. $300 billion of financial assistance or money sent from migrant workers to families and friends at home flows from, not to, but from the U.S. each year. So almost a $500 billion. Global cities contain concentrations of people and infrastructure that allows for coordination of international economy. We're in a very connected world nowadays. Provides hubs of international finance and technology, and its impact on social and economic structures in urban areas and residents is important. Creates a sharp divide between global elite and those who provide them services. The conclusion is our urban future is evolving. The growth of information technology may lead to demographic shifts back to rural areas. So for example, during COVID-19, people discovered that they can still do their jobs and not have to live in a big city. They can live in an urban area or rural area. Cities that will grow in the new urban environment can offer traditional services and cultural amenities to attract a creative class. So one of the great advantages of an urban area is the ability to have museums and other cultural way stations for people. A widening gap between those who benefit from global cities and those who don't may occur. So as wealth and income inequality continues to climb, we may discover that in fact the gap between the haves and the have-not increases as well.